Welcome to the second point of our module 3. And as I mentioned in the first recording, I'm answering questions in the live discussion, and I sent PDF copies of my insights and also outline of answers to the questions. So let's move on with questions and answer on modernity and dependency, development and underdevelopment. Your questions, comments. Development defined by the West creates a dichotomy between the third world and the developed West. But what about the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Is it also a Western concept that perpetuates this dichotomy, or a possible solution to bridging the gap between the developed and developing countries? First of all, we will discuss more in depth about this issue in Module 5. But let me already give some insights for us to consider. First of all, let us appraise ourselves of the UN Sustainable Development Principle. It is based on the following promises: that both human and environmental needs will be taken into account to ensure the sustainability of society and the continuance of its ecosystems. And the other promise is development will meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, these are the promises of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But what happens in reality? First of all, these goals are based on neoliberal capitalism, and they preserve capitalist discourse, ideology, and practice. So, in a certain way, it contradicts the practice of capitalism, contradicts the goals and promises of sustainable development, because there's no true well-being and long-term sustainability. Look at climate change. It's worsening. And look at social inequalities. We will be discussing about that more and more. I already said something about it in discussing about Marx and socialism in the previous lecture. The problem with the current SDs, their emphasis is on economic growth as a driver for well-being, which views nature as a commodity. So even if you want to balance the protection of the environment with human needs, and at the same time your economic model is capitalism, how can it truly be sustainable in a long-term way? Unfortunately, Western capitalist standards and practices do not help in that sense. Well, those who are pro-capitalist might think I'm bringing in a communist discourse. It's not about political alliance here. It's about social analysis of what capitalism is doing to the world. Given that development resulted in the worsening of poverty for the third world, can we assume that the ideologies behind the movement was subsequently disregarded or erased entirely by the West? Additional question that can be put in the same line: were problems such as systematic oppression and exploitation that emerged from development inevitable, or were there other factors that contributed to these problems? Again, reminder, the Western model of development is based on capitalism, which in itself is about unequal sharing of gains through the commodification of human labor. We can be for or against, but that's the reality. You can look at the corporate world. Does the boss on top get the same salary as the janitor down there? And how do we justify that? The boss went to university, so he invested in his education. The janitor just started to clean as soon as he or she could. These are ideologies that Karl Marx will say are the beliefs that protect and sustain the current social system. However, the model of development that is promoted by the West is based on this. So that's why even if the promise is always about a better life, the reality does not follow suit, because the developing countries in a certain way reproduce the same inequality within itself. If you will go to Asia and to Africa, what do we find? We find a few Asians, a few Africans who are as rich as Westerns, Europeans, Americans, and the majority of the people are somewhere in the middle, higher middle, middle, lower middle, and extreme low. So, developing countries reproduce the Western model of capitalism in a hierarchical form. How come stereotypes on the third world remained and their great progress and growth haven't been made public? Now, I bring in a question for reflection. Who is making progress in the third world? The entire population or just a few? Not only think about that, observe in Metro Manila. Again, do not take my comments as accusative. I'm not blaming anyone. We are not doing a moral class, but I'm highlighting a social analysis of what's really happening right now. So, a third world might progress, but within that third world, progress is only felt by a few, and the majority still remain living in poverty. What if such a gap between the developed and underdeveloped nations are actually necessary for some reason? Now, that's the problem. We are in a society that's created by human beings, and we are extremely good at justifying the ideology that we support. So, if we want to justify this gap, we are then supporting the view that all is fine as is, right? We will always find reasons to argue that such gap is needed, but these reasons are not based on science in a physical way, but on politics. And politics are socially constructed ideologies. Should there be a gap between developed and developed nations? Maybe that's up for us to think and discuss. Thank you very much for following this short discussion. I hope it gives you insight. Again, not to feed you with my answers, but to push you to think, reflect, and search. Thank you very much.